Hi, everyone. In this episode, we delve into chilling accounts of creatures so bizarre and elusive that they will challenge your understanding of the natural world. Bundle up as we hear the chilling details, examine the evidence, and attempt to unravel the truth behind these enigmatic creatures. So, if you're in it to win it, please squash that subscribe button and let's get into the stories. Have you ever been to Mount Hood? It's a volcanic ridge on the northern border of Oregon. It's less than a 2-hour drive from Portland if the traffic cooperates. The terrain becomes accessible only after navigating the beautiful scenic byway. There's a reason Mount Hood is climbed so often. The view there is astonishing. From the glacier-capped peak, you can see Mirror Lake and the surrounding Pacific Northwest, but you have to earn that view. It's a lot of hard work to get there. I thought that's what I was doing. I packed ropes, ice axes, and all of the essential mountaineering equipment I would need. Hood wasn't my first climb, but it was going to be my most significant. Now, I guess it's become significant for entirely different reasons. I shrugged off anyone warning me not to climb alone. The season was optimal, and like I said, I was experienced. Besides, convincing my friends to abandon the comfort of their homes for the altitude of the mountain was easier said than done. I expected the climb to take roughly 7 hours, but I planned for 10 just in case, factoring in if I would need to stop more than expected or to eat or reevaluate my positioning. I wanted to be able to afford those pauses. My plan was to reach the summit, then descend to a suitable location for camp, then finish the climb back down once dawn started rolling in. Things went so well at first that I forgot the scope of the mountain. I forgot to be humble or cautious. I reached my destination in just 6 hours and stood there at length in absolute wonder. When I eventually collected myself and resolved to begin the first half of my descent, I realized that Mount Hood hadn't been as idle as I was. The snow behind me had shifted in a way that made my path unintelligible. I braved as much as I could before lack of visibility demanded that I choose another route down. And now time wasn't on my side. I'd need to set up camp soon. A reminder to not underestimate the mountain and to not be so arrogant. But I'd memorized several of the routes up and down the mountain. I knew I could find another one if I was careful. And so I started to recalculate. But I didn't just find another route. I also found what was perhaps the mountain's only other resident in the area. But, unlike me, this resident was designed to live in that icy climate. It was designed to thrive there and, most importantly, to blend in. It was designed to be the mountain's apex predator. And when it saw me, it knew at once that I was only prey. To navigate from one path to another, I had to move along the side of the mountain. A ridge of ice separated me from my goal. I held the ice pick tightly in my hand and pulled myself over the ridge. However, instead of seeing safety on the other side, it was the creature looking back at me. It must have heard my pick striking the ice. Its beady black eyes were already fixed on my location when my head peeked above the edge. Its dark earth-colored fur and the thin layer of snow coating its back and shoulders helped it disappear against the backdrop of the mountain. If it wasn't for the slow rise and fall of the creature's chest and the wisps of condensation that fled its lips with every exhale, I might not have seen it at all. The hair framed its face like a hood. The skin underneath was dark and calloused. The creature's expression was so stiff it looked like it was carved from wood. Pointed teeth jutted from its thick lips. Its nostrils were wide and pressed flat against the monster's face. It looked like something dug up from the ice, like something born in a time before the first man or woman ever walked the earth. It was old and terrifying, and it ran at me. I slipped, dropped the ice pick in my hand, slid down the ridge of ice I was clinging to like it was a cold metal slide. It threw me down into a heap of snow. I felt my ribs crunch against a stone buried somewhere below the white. I rolled, landed on my back. I was lucky not to be buried alive. My eyes scanned the sky, still in shock and focused mostly on feeling and checking my ribs with my gloved hands. I was trying to assess the damage. Then I remembered why I fell. I looked back up the ice ridge and the creature was there. It gripped the column I'd just been thrown from with trained and powerful fingers. It hopped down one leap at a time, never unsure of its footing. It was closing in fast. I could hear the snarling. I could imagine myself being chewed between those sharp, stained teeth. I could imagine myself being thrown. It was huge, and it was surely stronger than me. I'd break against the mountain if I hit it again. I got up and ran. Quick and clumsy, what other choice did I have? I ran and tripped and fell and toppled. I eventually reached the part of the mountain where the snow was thin and the trees still dared to grow. By that point, the thing chasing me had disappeared, but I was too tired to go on. I slept there in the mud. I was found sometime the next day by rescue personnel. Before they could even drag me to my feet, I was ranting about the creature I'd seen. They didn't believe me. I guess it was an impossible story. And I was in a state of delirium, wasn't I? Scared, damaged, and dehydrated. I knew, from their perspective, that it was much more likely that I imagined the beast. But I don't remember that thing like I remember my dreams. No. It's much, much more clear. I remember it like I remember Mirror Lake. I remember it like I remember that summit. It was as real as the rest of it, and as terrifying as the view was beautiful. A couple of years ago, I got the chance to do a few days of house sitting for a friend in northwestern Washington outside Lake Stevens. I'd always dreamed about living out in the country, even though I'd never spent much time out there, so I jumped at the chance. Amy's place wasn't big, but it sat on a nice piece of wooded property. It was really rural with a dirt road and everything. I think it had been her grandparents' place and she'd inherited it. Anyway, she gave me the run of the place and said I could do what I wanted, but I should be inside by dark. I remember thinking that was a weird thing to say. I mean, I was in my 20s. I wasn't a kid with a curfew. But hey, Amy was paying me to have a weekend in the country, so I decided not to argue. Anyway, I found the little dirt driveway just fine and got there with plenty of time for my friend to head to the airport. I spent the day getting to know her 2 old dogs, got myself settled, and was tired enough from the drive to go to bed early. As far as house-sitting gigs go, this was easy. It felt like a little vacation, like I was getting paid to hang out in a little house in the woods and live out my homesteading fantasies without actually having to commit to buying a house. It was great. The only thing that was weird about it was how dark it got at night. I've lived in Seattle all my life, so I wasn't prepared for just how dark it got when the sun finally went down out here. It was dark and quiet, and house was far enough off the main road that I couldn't even hear the occasional passing car. About the only thing I did hear at night was rustling from the woods. There had to be animals out there, deer or maybe even a bobcat. I wasn't worried though. The dogs and I were good. The night before Amy was coming home, I decided to go check the garden for salad fixings. It was a nice big plot with a fence around it to discourage rabbits or deer. I don't garden, but Amy had told me that all I had to do was water it, and it'd take care of itself. When I got into the garden, I noticed that it looked like something had been eating some of the plants. Deer, probably, or rabbits. I looked around the fence line and didn't see any holes, but there was a section that was folded down, like something had stepped on it. There was an old shed on the property that was where Amy kept her gardening stuff. The door was hard to open. That thing was old. But I did find some stakes I could use to prop up the sagging fence, so I grabbed them. The shed was literally set into the tree line, so I had to get right up to the woods to get into it. It was closer to the trees than I'd been the whole time I'd been there, and I remember the temperature really dropped that close to the trees. It felt weird too, like something was watching me. I told myself that I was just being silly, but I also didn't stick around. I just grabbed what I needed and headed back to the garden plot. I did a decent patch job on the fence by tying the fence mesh to the stake. When I was done, I noticed that a few tomatoes had fallen off the vine. They weren't even bruised, but they were still green. I decided to stick them on the windowsill so they could finish ripening. I picked some ripe tomatoes, a couple radishes, and some lettuce leaves and took them into the house to make my salad and grill a burger. The dogs and I had a nice, quiet dinner. They woke up enough to stagger over to their food bowls and then watch me eat my burger and salad. Turns out I'm not immune to big sad pibble eyes, and I ended up giving them part of my burger. Probably shouldn't have, but oh well. In the middle of the night, I heard rustling again. I woke up enough to listen, and it sounded far enough away that I decided not to worry about it. But then I heard a snapping sound a lot closer. The dogs perked up too. Now, here's where it gets weird, because those dogs. They were old and sweet, and they'd spent most of the day sleeping in the nearest warm sunbeam like pit bull-shaped pillows. Right now, they were perked up, looking out the door toward the kitchen. They didn't move. They were just sitting there looking. I heard rustling around again, like something was walking around. I figured it was that deer that had broken down the fence and that the garden was, once again, in mortal danger. I slid out of bed, grabbed my mag light from the bedside table, and tiptoed my way down the hall. The kitchen looked out over the garden, so my plan was to shine the flashlight out the window and hopefully scare the deer away. The tree line was a good distance away, but I couldn't see much in the way of detail that far out in the yard, just spiky shapes. What I did see was something moving around in the garden. I flicked on the mag light and aimed out at the yard. At first, I didn't see anything, but I swept the light across the yard and then I saw something I never want to see again. It looked like a hairy, reddish-brown lump, but it definitely wasn't a deer. It was too big. I thought maybe it was a bear because it stood up on its hind legs. Then it turned around and I got a look, and it was no bear. The thing had this weirdly shaped head and no hair on its face, like a gorilla. But there was no way there could be a gorilla loose in the woods of northern Washington. It was huge, too. Taller than the 6-foot stake I'd put into the ground to fix the fence earlier and built like a linebacker. Whatever it was, it did not like the light because it wrinkled its face into a snarl and let out this growl that sounded like 4 angry dogs. I panicked. I dropped the flashlight and tried to back up, but I was shaking so hard that I went to my knees. I heard stomping across the yard, getting closer to the kitchen window, and I thought for sure that whatever the thing was, it was going to come right for me. Then the night got really quiet, absolutely silent. I could hear my own breathing, but that was it. It was like every horror movie I'd ever seen. Just before the creature breaks into the house and attacks the main character, that's when Amy's dogs, those sweet, elderly dogs, came scrambling down the hall, barking their heads off. They practically climbed on top of me, barking at the window. I smelled something awful, like skunk and BO, and the dogs went crazy. After the world's longest minute, the smell went away. It took a while for the dogs to calm down. Me, I did not calm down. In fact, I don't think I slept the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I peeked out the kitchen window at the garden. The fence was down like it had been stepped on. Something big had clearly been at the plants. When Amy got home later that day, I told her that something had been in the garden. I didn't say what. There was something about her expression that told me I didn't need to. I left her place to go home, leaving way before sundown. We're still friends, but I told her I'll never house sit for her again. I never believed in weird or strange stories before. I'd always say that people were making it up or something. That was until something weird happened to me, and it changed my life. Now, I can't help but think there's some truth in everything people encounter. Details might not be clear or whatever, but it doesn't mean it didn't actually happen. I was riding the train in Chicago. It's a great experience. It really is, and it shows you how people used to travel before the invention of cars. People make fun of me for how much longer it takes, but it's just the experience of it. There's always a few interesting people on the train as well, and I've spent many hours drawing the different people sitting on the train. It's a great exercise for anyone who's into the arts, and great practice drawing people in motion, learning anatomy. I also like to look out the window at the different stops the train makes. During one of these stops, I was looking out the window, kind of daydreaming, not really paying attention to anything. Something or someone moved and caught my eye, and I turned my head and saw this girl. She was alone, no one standing around her. Her back turned to me with long blonde hair that almost reached the small of her back. I didn't really think anything of it, and the train eventually went on its way. I began doodling, not really drawing anything, just making shapes and scribbles. 2 stops later, I swear I saw the same girl. Long blonde hair, arms wrapped around a book held to her chest, standing alone. This time she turned her head slowly and looked right at me. Her eyes were solid black, shiny, almost like precious stones. Her face was expressionless. She just stared at me until the train started up again. I thought maybe I didn't get enough sleep, maybe I saw it wrong, or I was just imagining it because I had been daydreaming on and off. Like when you get super bored sometimes and you swear you saw something this way, or you picked up something from the store, but you actually didn't. I just kept telling myself that until we made the next stop. She was there again. This time people were walking past her, but it seemed like they didn't notice she was there. She looked right at me, eyes big and black, but it almost seemed like she was looking through me. This time, she got on the train. I panicked a little, dropping my pencil, my hand shaking a little. I bent down to get my pencil from the floor, then just waited. Something told me she'd end up in my train car. I sat in my seat, waiting, sweating, my hands shaking every time I tried to draw. I'd look around from time to time, but I didn't see the girl. I just stared out the window, trying to take my mind off of what I had seen. I started to calm myself down a bit. An hour went by without me really noticing. I don't know why, but I began to look around at the people sitting around me. Far off, at the opposite end from where I was sitting, I saw the top of a blonde head. The hair looked straight. It looked like it could be the girl I had seen at the other stops with the black eyes. I closed my sketchbook, slid the pencil into the metal rings that bound it, and just started tapping my foot. Panic began to swell up inside me. Looking out the window wasn't working anymore, so I got up to find a restroom. When I walked back to my seat, she wasn't there anymore. The blonde head wasn't in the seat I saw her in. I sat back down in my own seat and kept looking over from time to time. Half an hour passed, she didn't return. Then an hour passed. She still wasn't in that seat. Was my mind playing tricks on me? Was she even really there at all? Time seemed to fly by. Eventually, we made our way into Chicago. When I got up from my seat, I could have sworn someone touched my hair. I looked around, but there was no one near me to do that. I kept my eyes open as we disembarked from the train, and as I made my way through the station, I called an Uber to bring me to my friend's house in Canaryville. I didn't have to wait long for the Uber, but I kept looking around, trying to see that girl again. The Uber driver made small talk. He was a nice enough guy, but I just wanted to get to my friend's house as fast as possible. I still couldn't wrap my head around what happened on the train. I looked out the window as Chicago passed by, taking in the city, the people. We got to my friend's, and I paid the Uber. I got out of the car, and I felt a cold chill down my spine. I turned around, and there she was across the street, her black eyes staring straight at me and her blonde hair blowing in the wind. I ran up to my friend's door and knocked as fast as I could. He pulled it open, and I almost jumped inside his house. I pointed across the street and told him what happened on the train. He started laughing, but he looked across the street and his face turned white. He saw her standing there, his mouth almost dropped to the floor. She turned her head and nodded towards us, then just disappeared when a car drove by. We both lost it and went out of the house looking around for her. The neighbors looked at us like we were insane. My friend went and asked if anyone saw the girl standing across the street. One of them did, but didn't understand why we were acting so crazy. We stayed up all night talking about it with some of our other friends. We kept looking outside, waiting to see if the girl would show up again across the street. But we never saw her again. Needless to say, I'm a little jumpy these days and I'm constantly looking around, expecting her to show up again. Did you know the Appalachian Trail is more than 2,000 miles long? 2,000 miles of woods, wilds, and wonder. As a dedicated member of the Park Service, I sometimes like to think that I've seen all that Appalachia has to offer. Every once in a while, however, Appalachia reminds me of my ego. It reminds me that the world is bigger than I think. The trees are taller, the shadows stretch further, and there are more things hiding in the forest than I could ever imagine. One such reminder came to me 3 years ago. I was surveying the trail as I sometimes did, searching a 10-mile stretch for signs of disrepair from the comfort of my ORV, or off-road vehicle for those who don't know. The trail was in good condition, thankfully. That afforded me a wandering gaze. My attention drifted, especially after I parked the vehicle to check in with my peers to see how their days were going, and if anyone needed help. I remember staring at my phone for a while, flicking from conversation to conversation. It was an easy day for everyone as far as I recall. Sometimes we'd have to schedule repairs to the trail or investigations into abandoned campsites and other miscellaneous tasks. A faint chattering drew my eyes back to the trees. I thought maybe it was a bird. It was a fast-paced cackle, unlike anything I'd heard in the woods before. I combed through the brush and the branches with a trained eye. There were no birds to be found. Still, the chattering persisted. It grew louder and heavier. It sounded as if the source of the commotion was getting closer. I still couldn't see it. I cut the engine to the ORV and waited. Another fit of laughter told me where to look, and finally, I spotted one of the chattering creatures. It looked like a pale little monkey, hairless and feral. It snapped its jaws and blinked its bulbous black eyes in my direction. If it wasn't for the creature's tail, I would have described it as a little man. It stared at me from its place high in the trees, cackling all the while. Then I noticed the sounds coming from elsewhere, coming from all around me. Appalachia was sending her tiny reminders that she is in charge. Before I knew it, there was a second creature, and then a third. I counted 6 in total before my eyes couldn't keep up with their sudden appearances. The more of them that gathered, the louder the other ones squealed. Eventually, they were shrieking like swine, bobbing in place and swaying their bodies. The little, screaming, sickly monkeys looked like they were dancing. They reveled in each other's screaming. When I tried to yell back, it only excited them more. What was I supposed to do? I took a picture of the clearest one. I took a picture, sent it to my peers, and started the ORV back up. They didn't like that. They flinched when the engine roared back to life. They didn't like being faced with something louder than they were. The small creatures started to throw things in my direction, twigs and stones and handfuls of nuts. They pelted me and the ORV. I sped away to escape them. Their improvised weapons continued to strike my back, even as I fled the scene. The crying followed me too. The monsters danced and darted along either side of the path, trying to keep up with my hurried escape. They managed to hold my pace for a few minutes. One by one, they dropped off and disappeared back into the forest. The nearest ranger was 7 miles away at that point. It felt like 100. When I finally caught up to him, I was out of breath and frantic. He laughed at me before I could say a single word. He then told me to give up the prank, already convinced that I'd sent some photoshopped image. I tried to argue, but he wouldn't have it. Neither did anyone else. I couldn't blame them, I guess. The cruel little dancers were unlike anything I'd ever heard of, let alone captured on film. The pictures weren't great either. I zoomed in to fill the frame, never stopping to consider that I'd sacrificed the quality of the image. Their erratic jumping didn't help either. They were tiny white blurs in the tree branches. The photos did look doctored. I pushed the encounter from the back of my mind. I let my ego creep back in, confident that I'd seen the monkeys for the last time. I thought again that Appalachia had shown me all of her colors. But eventually, the creatures showed up again. They appeared again last year, another reminder to be humbled by the secrets of Mother Nature. She put one of the dancers on my doorstep. Just outside the office, I saw one of them again. This one wasn't screaming, it was whimpering. It was squatting in the trees, watching me with wary eyes. It looked injured. I tried to get closer, to get a better look. It scurried further into the woods each time that I took a step. I called animal control. The other dancers came before they arrived. They surrounded the wounded one and chanted all around him. They dove toward the injured creature and dragged him into the woods. I watched the little monster's fingernails scratch into the bark, fighting against his kind. He failed. Animal control arrived too late. I've heard of what chimps can do to other wounded apes. I imagine something similar happened to the wounded dancer. But why had he come to my door? Had the dancers kept tabs on me? Did they remember me from our first encounter when I fled from their assault? The ordeal has left me with those questions and more. I guess they're my latest reminder. I'm asking myself lately, how many of them are there? How smart might they be? And if they're willing to do that to their own kind, what would they have done to me that day if I hadn't sped away? Keep your eyes on the trees, folks, and if you hear the chattering, run. I really enjoy hiking. I like finding cool things on the trails. Stones, leaves, mushrooms, little pieces of bark, and even tiny insects and things like that. It helps me clear my mind to do things out in nature. So, when the weather is right, or if I start to feel a bit antsy, I'll go for a stroll. It was May, so we started getting a lot of rain. It's one of my favorite smells, so I'd usually hold out until I saw the clouds in the sky. My friend was supposed to meet up with me that day, but it turns out she wasn't feeling well. I knew I didn't want to sit inside though, so I decided to head out on my own. I had done it plenty of times before, going on the trail alone, and it would give me more time and space to let my mind be free. I put on my raincoat and boots. I grabbed my satchel so I might be able to collect some fun things, and I headed out the door. The trail wasn't a far drive, it was just a few miles from where I lived. As soon as I saw the trees, my heart was filled with joy. I get really excited about seeing that trail before everything. I don't know, maybe I'm weird. I pull into the parking area. I wanted to make sure I didn't leave anything important behind, so I checked my back seats and glove compartment. I typically bring a water bottle, flashlight, and a pocket knife, just in case I might need it. I grabbed this stuff and a compact umbrella because I had been hoping for rain. I shoved all of it into my satchel and I headed onto the path. It had rained the day before, so I could still smell the wet leaves and dirt. The ground was pretty slippery, but once you get going, you kind of get used to it. This particular trail was known for having lots of wildlife. I had seen plenty of birds, a few snakes, some squirrels and raccoons, and once I saw a deer. I hadn't seen anything super threatening. Well, other than the snakes. I hate snakes. But nothing like a wolf or anything like that. Nobody seemed to be on the trail that day or the day before. I didn't see any footprints in the mud. To be fair, it was rather early in the morning when I went, maybe earlier than the average person would like to go for a hike. But it didn't deter me at all. I knew the trail, like I said. The clouds were definitely getting more and more dark as I hiked. I could tell that I'd get what I'd asked for. Honestly, looking back at it all, I do regret it. I started to feel tiny raindrops fall onto my hair. I took out my umbrella. It wasn't pouring yet, but you could count on it getting to that point in the matter of seconds. I also took that moment to take out my water bottle. I took a drink and sort of held out the bottle to collect some of the rainwater. Some people freak out in these conditions, but I was completely at ease. It feels refreshing to me. So I'm just soaking up the environment and the ambience when I hear a strange sound in the distance. It sort of sounded like a weird, high-pitched shrieking. So I looked around. I thought maybe it was a deer. But I'm not a wildlife expert. It could have been something else, or it could have been nothing at all. And with the rain that started to pick up, I could have just been hearing normal noises. It was a little muffled, and it sounded a ways away from me. I didn't see anything, so I packed up my water bottle and continued walking. My umbrella was up, so the sound of the rain was pretty loud around my head. But I kept hearing something moving in the woods off to my right, so I'd stop and look and listen. I was naive, I suppose, too trusting. I kept brushing it off. The rain is knocking some branches around, because that's what it sounded like, branches being disturbed. There was a point when the sounds got more intrusive. I did start to panic a little. Mostly, I had this feeling like the sound was following me, so my mind started creating theories. Was there some stalker person following me? Did they know where I lived? I was scared, but I was scared of the wrong thing. I halfway expected to see a creepy person or a bear. That's not what I saw at all. As I'm looking around to identify what is making all of the ruckus, I notice to my right something moving. My focus is entirely on this one particular tree. The trunk of the tree is decently thick, and there's plenty of branches on it. but I started to realize that some of the branches I had been looking at weren't really branches at all. They were antlers. My heart kind of relaxes. It's just a deer following me through the trees. No big deal. I take my eyes off of it. I turn back towards the path and take a couple steps when I hear something behind me. Let me just say that what I had seen before was not a deer. It was now standing by the closest tree to my back in the right. It was basically on the path. But it was standing up like a human does. Its legs weren't human though. They looked more like deer legs with hooves. Its body almost looked like it could easily camouflage with a tree because it seemed very, frail. It looked like its limbs could have been branches because of how thin they were. It literally looked like part of the tree. The only thing that helped me realize that I wasn't looking at a tree, other than the quick movement, were its eyes that seemed to glow kind of like an animal's eyes in the dark, and the weird deer skull that it was wearing on top of its face. As quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I didn't even have time to grab my pocket knife. I don't know if I trust my eyes. If I'm being completely honest, it all happened so fast. So in the end, I'm not sure, but I wanted to share this with you anyway.